The torches flicker in the darkness. Footsteps echo through stone corridors so massive they seem to touch the sky itself. A young scholar's hands tremble as he runs his fingers across carved walls covered in mathematical equations that won't be discovered in Europe for another 300 years. His breath catches. Behind him, voices grow louder, shouting, the clash of metal, the crackle of flames that shouldn't be there. He looks back at the thousands of manuscripts surrounding him, centuries of knowledge, medicine, astronomy, philosophy, and realizes with horror what's about to happen. This isn't just a library burning. This is the erasure of an entire world. The year is 1591. The place is Timbuktu, a city whose name you know, but whose true story has been stolen from you. What you're witnessing is the systematic destruction of one of the greatest centers of learning humanity has ever known, a place where over 25,000 students studied mathematics, astronomy, law, medicine, and philosophy, while most of Europe couldn't read. But here's what they never told you in school. This wasn't an isolated incident. This was step one in the most successful cover-up in human history. The deliberate erasure of African civilization's achievements so complete, so thorough, that 500 years later, most people still believe the lie. The lie that Africa had no history. The lie that Africans built nothing. The lie that before colonization, the continent was primitive, backward, and waiting to be civilized. Every single word of that is false. And what makes it worse? They knew it was false. They always knew. You're not ready for what comes next, because what I'm about to show you isn't just forgotten history, it's suppressed history. Evidence deliberately destroyed, knowledge intentionally buried, entire civilizations erased from the textbooks so completely that suggesting they existed at all gets you called a conspiracy theorist. But the proof is undeniable, and once you see it, you'll never look at history the same way again. Let's start with something simple: money. The year is 1324. A man walks into Cairo, the wealthiest city in the medieval world, with a caravan so large it takes an entire day to enter the city gates. His name is Mansa Musa, and he's about to accidentally crash an entire economy. Mansa Musa, Emperor of Mali, is on a pilgrimage to Mecca. With him he brings 60,000 men, 12,000 servants, 80 camels, each carrying 300 pounds of pure gold, and a personal spending budget that would make modern billionaires weep. He's not showing off. This is just how he travels. In Cairo, Mansa Musa is so generous, buying everything he sees, tipping everyone he meets, donating gold to every mosque and scholar, that he floods the market with gold. The value of gold in Egypt doesn't recover for over a decade. One man, one visit, economic devastation through excessive generosity. Historians estimate his wealth at $400 billion in today's money. That makes him the richest human being who has ever lived. Not Rockefeller, not Bezos, not even close. Here's what they don't tell you about this. Mansa Musa's wealth didn't come from nowhere. Mali wasn't rich by accident. The empire controlled half the world's gold supply. Half! They had salt mines so valuable that salt was literally traded ounce for ounce with gold. They had copper mines, ironworks, and trade networks that stretched from the Atlantic Ocean to the Red Sea. The University of Sankore in Timbuktu, the one being burned in our opening scene, had a library containing over 700,000 manuscripts. That's more books than existed in all of Europe at the time. Think about that. While Europe was in the Dark Ages, while most Europeans were illiterate peasants living in wooden huts, African scholars in Timbuktu were performing cataract surgery, calculating the circumference of the earth, and debating the ethics of slavery. Wait, did I say debating the ethics of slavery? Yes, African scholars were writing about the immorality of slavery in the 1200s, 300 years before Europeans would have that conversation. But you never learned this in school, did you? You learned about Columbus discovering America. You learned about the European Renaissance. You learned about the Age of Exploration. You didn't learn that the Europeans who financed the Renaissance did it with African gold, stolen African gold. You didn't learn that the exploration was actually invasion. You didn't learn that before a single European ship arrived, Africa had empires, universities, cities, and wealth that made European kingdoms look like poverty-stricken backwaters. This erasure was intentional, and it gets so much worse. Fast forward to 1871. A German explorer named Karl Mauch stumbles through the forests of modern-day Zimbabwe and stops dead in his tracks. In front of him stand walls, massive stone walls expertly constructed without mortar, stretching 36 feet high. An entire city of granite covering almost 1,800 acres with curved towers and intricate stonework that would make medieval European masons jealous. Great Zimbabwe. Mauch stands there, jaw on the ground, and immediately declares, "This cannot be African." Not because of science, not because of evidence, because his racist worldview cannot accept that Africans could build something this sophisticated. So he invents a story. He claims, with zero evidence, that Great Zimbabwe must have been built by Phoenicians or maybe King Solomon's people, anyone but Africans. The colonial government of Rhodesia, named after colonizer Cecil Rhodes, loved this theory so much they made it official. For the next 100 years, archaeologists who dared suggest that Africans built Great Zimbabwe had their careers destroyed. Evidence that proved African origin was literally buried, destroyed, or locked away. Caton Thompson, a British archaeologist, conclusively proved in 1929 that Great Zimbabwe was built by Africans. The Rhodesian government banned her findings from schools and museums. They chose the lie. They chose it because admitting the truth would destroy their entire justification for colonization. How can you claim you're civilizing a continent when that continent was already building architectural marvels while your ancestors were still figuring out plumbing? Great Zimbabwe wasn't alone. The Congo Kingdom had a capital city, Mbanza, Congo, so impressive that Portuguese visitors in the 1490s compared it favorably to Lisbon. They described wide streets, royal palaces, complex bureaucracy, and a legal system sophisticated enough that it had written codes and specialized courts. The Kingdom of Axum in Ethiopia built towering obelisks and underground tombs so advanced that Italian archaeologists initially refused to believe Africans constructed them. The Ashanti Empire in West Africa developed a road system and communication network so efficient that messages could travel hundreds of miles in a single day. The Benin Empire created bronze and brass artworks so technically perfect that when British soldiers looted them in 1897, European experts declared they must have been made by Europeans, because again, their racism wouldn't allow them to believe African artisans could achieve such mastery. Here's the pattern you need to see. Every time colonizers encountered evidence of advanced African civilization, they did one of three things: claim someone else built it, destroy the evidence, or steal it and put it in a European museum. The British Museum alone holds over 73,000 African artifacts, stolen artifacts, many from civilizations that most people don't even know existed because the evidence of their existence is sitting in a warehouse in London. This wasn't accidental. This was policy. Now we need to talk about why this happened. Because this wasn't just about racism. This was about money. This was about control. This was about justifying the most profitable crime in human history, the Atlantic slave trade. Between 1500 and 1866, Europeans kidnapped and enslaved between 12 and 15 million Africans. 12 to 15 million. And those are just the ones who survived the journey. Scholars estimate that for every enslaved person who made it to the Americas, 4 to 5 died during capture or transport. That means the total human cost was somewhere between 50 and 75 million people. 50 to 75 million. To put that in perspective, that's more than the entire population of France at the time. That's more than died in World War I. That's a Holocaust-level atrocity spread over 3 centuries. And here's the thing about atrocities on that scale. You need a justification. You need a story that makes it okay, a narrative that allows good people to participate in evil and still sleep at night. So they invented one. They created the myth of the savage African, the story that Africans were primitive, uncivilized, barely human, that slavery was actually helping them by bringing them into contact with superior European culture and Christianity. But here's the problem with that narrative. It only works if you erase the evidence that disproves it. If people knew that Africans had empires and universities while Europeans were in the Dark Ages, the narrative collapses. If people knew that African metallurgy was so advanced that Europeans were still trying to figure out their techniques centuries later, the narrative collapses. If people knew that African medicine included successful cataract surgery, cesarean sections, and smallpox inoculation before any of that existed in Europe, the narrative collapses. So they erased it, systematically, deliberately, completely. When Europeans colonized Africa in the 1800s, they didn't just extract resources, they extracted history. They burned libraries, they demolished monuments, they melted down golden artifacts, they destroyed anything that contradicted their narrative of African inferiority. In 1897, British soldiers invaded the Benin Kingdom in what is now Nigeria. The Benin Kingdom was rich, powerful, and had existed for over 7 centuries. Its capital was described by Dutch visitors as having great long streets that were 7 or 8 times broader than the warmest street in Amsterdam. The British burned it to the ground. But before they burned it, they looted it. The Benin bronzes, thousands of sophisticated brass plaques and sculptures that documented Benin's history were stolen and sold to European museums. The British Museum still refuses to return them. Why did they burn Benin? Officially, they claimed it was retaliation for the death of some British officials. Actually, Benin was in debt to British trading companies and was trying to stop the exploitative trade practices that were bleeding its economy dry. The British wanted to open Benin's markets by force, so they invented a justification, invaded, looted everything valuable, and burned the rest. Then they wrote the history books. In those history books, Benin became a savage kingdom that needed to be civilized. The British became heroes, bringing enlightenment to darkness. This is the pattern: invade, loot, destroy, rewrite. And it worked so well that 100 years later, most people have never even heard of the Benin Kingdom. They don't know about Mansa Musa. They don't know about Great Zimbabwe. They don't know about Timbuktu's universities. They know the lie. And the lie has been so successful that even suggesting these civilizations existed makes people skeptical. But here's where it gets personal, because this erasure didn't just affect history, it affected medicine, technology, science, innovation, things that could have saved lives. Let me give you one example that will make your blood boil. Smallpox. Smallpox killed more human beings than any other disease in history, between 300 and 500 million people in the 20th century alone. It was so devastating that when a vaccine was finally developed by Edward Jenner in 1796, he was hailed as a hero who saved humanity. Here's what they don't tell you. Africans were inoculating against smallpox decades, possibly centuries before Jenner. Onesimus, an enslaved man in Boston, told his enslaver Cotton Mather about the African practice of variolation, deliberately infecting someone with a mild case of smallpox to create immunity. Mather tried it during a 1721 outbreak. It worked. Mortality rates dropped from 15% to 2%. But Jenner gets the credit. Why? Because the idea that an enslaved African man saved hundreds of lives contradicted the narrative. It suggested that Africans had valuable knowledge, that they were intelligent, observant, scientific. So they erased Onesimus from the story. This happened over and over again. African metallurgy techniques that Europeans couldn't replicate, African agricultural practices that were more sustainable than European methods, African architectural innovations that kept buildings cool in extreme heat without modern technology. All erased, all uncredited, all stolen. The Kingdom of Kush in Sudan was smelting iron at industrial scale and creating steel weapons when Europeans were still in the Bronze Age. Their techniques were so advanced that modern metallurgists still study them. Did you learn that in school? The Mali Empire had a currency system so stable and reliable that it was accepted from Morocco to Mecca. They had standardized weights and measures. They had banking systems and credit arrangements. Did you learn that? No. You learned that Africans were primitive, that they had no history before Europeans arrived, that colonization was somehow beneficial because it brought civilization to a dark continent. Every word of that is a deliberate, calculated lie, and the evidence was destroyed to maintain that lie. So let's talk about what really happened. Because now that you know what was erased, you need to understand why the erasure was so thorough, so complete, that most people still believe the lie 500 years later. It comes down to three things: economic control, psychological warfare, and historical legitimacy. Economic control first. Africa isn't poor. Africa has never been poor. Africa is the richest continent on Earth in terms of natural resources: gold, diamonds, copper, iron, cobalt, coltan, oil, uranium, you name it, Africa has it. The colonization of Africa was the largest wealth transfer in human history. European countries became superpowers by extracting African resources using African labor. The British Empire, the French Empire, the Portuguese Empire, all of them were built on African wealth. But here's the problem with theft at that scale. If people understand what you're doing, they resist, they rebel, they fight back. So you need to convince them that you're not stealing. You need to make them believe that you're helping, that you're bringing civilization, progress, Christianity to people who desperately need it. That's where the psychological warfare comes in. If you can convince people, both the colonizer and the colonized, that Africans are inferior, that they have no history, no achievements, no civilization, then colonization becomes not just acceptable, but morally righteous. You're not exploiting people, you're educating them. You're not stealing their resources, you're teaching them how to use those resources properly. This psychological warfare was so effective that it created generational trauma. Even today, centuries after colonization, many Africans have internalized this narrative. Many believe on some level that their ancestors built nothing, achieved nothing, contributed nothing to human civilization. That's how complete the erasure was. And then there's historical legitimacy. If Europeans admitted that Africans had sophisticated civilizations, civilizations that in many ways exceeded European achievements, then the moral foundation for colonization crumbles. You can't claim you're the superior race destined to rule if the people you're ruling had universities while you were illiterate. You can't claim you're bringing civilization if the civilization you're destroying is more advanced than your own. So the history had to be rewritten. Libraries burned, not just in Timbuktu, but across the continent. Oral histories dismissed as myth, archaeological evidence buried or destroyed, artifacts stolen and hidden in museum basements, academic careers destroyed for anyone who dared challenge the narrative. This was systematic. This was organized. This was policy. The Belgian Congo alone under King Leopold II resulted in the deaths of 10 million Africans between 1885 and 1908. 10 million! That's a second Holocaust that most people don't even know happened. And while Leopold was killing millions, he was praised in Europe as a humanitarian bringing civilization to Africa. The French in Algeria, the British in Kenya, the Portuguese in Angola and Mozambique, the Germans in Namibia, where they committed the first genocide of the 20th century. All of it justified by the same lie, that Africans were primitive and needed European guidance. All of it dependent on erasing evidence that proved otherwise. But here's the thing about truth. You can bury it, you can burn it, you can ban it from textbooks and destroy academic careers and rewrite history books. But you can't erase it completely. The evidence survived. Not all of it, not even most of it, but enough. Enough that we can reconstruct what was stolen from human history. The manuscripts of Timbuktu, hundreds of thousands of them survived, hidden in caves, buried in sand, protected by families who understood their value. Today, scholars are digitizing these documents, and what they're finding is revolutionary. Medical texts describing surgical procedures, astronomical charts mapping the movement of stars, legal texts debating ethics and justice, mathematical treatises proving that Africans were doing algebra and geometry centuries before Europe existed. Great Zimbabwe? The archaeological evidence is undeniable. Radiocarbon dating proves it was built by the Shona people between the 11th and 14th centuries. The stonework techniques are uniquely African. The artifacts found there, pottery, tools, gold ornaments, all point to a sophisticated civilization engaged in international trade. The Benin bronzes, they're sitting in museums across Europe, silent testimony to the artistic and technical sophistication of a kingdom that Europeans claimed was primitive. The plaques depict Benin's history in incredible detail: royal ceremonies, military victories, trade relationships, cultural practices. Each one is proof that Europeans lied about African civilization. And then there are the eyewitness accounts. Portuguese sailors in the 1400s wrote extensively about what they found in Africa. They described impressive cities, sophisticated governments, thriving trade networks. They were amazed by what they saw. Dutch traders in the 1600s wrote similar accounts. They described Benin City as cleaner and better organized than most European cities. These accounts exist. They're in archives across Europe. They contradict every part of the primitive Africa narrative. So why don't people know about them? Because they've been buried under 2 centuries of colonial propaganda. The later Europeans, the ones doing the colonizing, ignored these early accounts. They created a new narrative, a false narrative, and repeated it so many times that it became truth. But the receipts are there. African scholars are reclaiming this history. Sheikh Anta Diop, John Henrik Clarke, Chancellor Williams, Yosef Ben Jochanan. These scholars spent their lives fighting to restore the historical record, often facing ridicule and professional sabotage from establishment historians who didn't want the narrative challenged. They were called radicals, Afrocentrists, conspiracy theorists. They were telling the truth. And increasingly, mainstream archaeology is catching up. DNA evidence is rewriting our understanding of human migration and cultural exchange. Archaeological techniques are revealing civilizations that were previously unknown. Climate science is helping us understand how environmental changes affected African societies. The truth is emerging, slowly, against resistance, but it's emerging. So why does this matter today? Why does it matter that history books lied about African civilizations centuries ago? Because the lie is still killing people. The narrative of African inferiority didn't end with colonization. It evolved, it adapted, it persists. It persists in the way Africa is portrayed in media as a place of poverty, disease, and war, never as a place of innovation, culture, and resilience. It persists in the way African countries are treated in international relations as perpetual charity cases, not as partners with valuable resources and knowledge. It persists in the way African immigrants are treated in Western countries, as people fleeing failed states, not as people whose countries were systematically destroyed by colonization and continue to be exploited by neo-colonial economic policies. It persists in education systems that spend weeks on European history and maybe one day on African history, and even then it's usually just slavery and colonization, never the civilizations that existed before. The lie creates real-world consequences. When people believe Africans contributed nothing to human civilization, it becomes easier to justify policies that harm Africa, easier to ignore modern exploitation, easier to dismiss African perspectives on global issues. The Democratic Republic of Congo has deposits of cobalt essential for smartphones and electric vehicles worth over $24 trillion. $24 trillion! That's more than the GDP of the United States. But the Congolese people are among the poorest on Earth. Why? Because multinational corporations extract the cobalt using exploitative labor practices, pay almost nothing to the Congolese government, and sell it for massive profits in the West. It's colonization by another name, and it's only possible because the narrative of African inferiority makes it seem acceptable. Because if Africans are primitive, then of course they need Western companies to extract their resources properly. Of course they can't manage their own wealth. Of course they need outside intervention. It's the same lie, just updated for the 21st century. The same lie affects education. African contributions to mathematics, science, medicine, and philosophy are still largely absent from curricula. Students grow up believing that civilization began in Greece and Rome, spread to Europe, and then to the rest of the world. They don't learn that mathematics originated in Africa, that the Egyptians, who were African, despite what your textbook's illustrations suggested, were doing geometry and algebra thousands of years before Greece existed. They don't learn that the University of Al-Qarawiyyin in Morocco, founded in 859 CE, is the oldest continuously operating university in the world. Not Oxford, not Bologna, Fez, Morocco. They don't learn that African philosophers were debating ethics, metaphysics, and epistemology while Europe was in the Dark Ages. This erasure damages everyone. It damages African people by denying them their heritage and perpetuating harmful stereotypes. It damages everyone else by depriving them of the full story of human achievement, by making them think human civilization is a European story, when it's actually a human story, with contributions from every continent. But here's what gives me hope. The truth is becoming impossible to suppress. The internet has made it harder to control narratives. African scholars and historians are publishing research. Museums are being pressured to return stolen artifacts. Activists are demanding that curricula include accurate African history. In 2021, France returned 26 artifacts to Benin, a tiny fraction of what was stolen, but a symbolic recognition that theft occurred. In 2023, Germany began the process of returning the Benin bronzes in its museums. These are small steps, inadequate steps, but they represent a shift in consciousness. People are starting to ask questions. Why are so many African artifacts in European museums? Why do history books barely mention African civilizations? Why does the narrative of European superiority persist despite mountains of evidence that it's false? These questions are dangerous to the status quo, because once you start questioning one narrative, you start questioning all of them. You start asking why Africa is poor when it has more natural resources than any other continent. You start asking why African countries can't seem to develop when they're still paying colonial debts and dealing with exploitative trade agreements forced on them by former colonizers. You start asking why Western countries that built their wealth on slavery and colonization haven't paid reparations. You start asking why the people who profited from crimes against humanity get to keep their profits. These are uncomfortable questions, questions that challenge the fundamental fairness of the current global order, questions that suggest maybe, just maybe, the wealth gap between the global North and the global South isn't the result of cultural superiority or work ethic or any of the other explanations we've been fed. Maybe it's the result of the largest robbery in human history. Maybe it's the result of a lie so big, so all-encompassing, that entire civilizations vanished from human memory. And maybe, just maybe, it's time to tell the truth. So let me tell you what the biggest lie actually is. It's not that Africans built nothing. The evidence proves that's false. It's not that Africans contributed nothing to human civilization. The evidence proves that's false too. The biggest lie is that erasing African history didn't matter. The lie is that it's just history, that it's in the past, that we should move on and focus on the present. But you can't understand the present without understanding the past. You can't understand why Africa is systematically exploited without understanding colonization. You can't understand why racial stereotypes persist without understanding the propaganda that created them. You can't understand the wealth of Europe and America without understanding where that wealth came from. History isn't dead. History is living in every inequality, every stereotype, every exploitative trade agreement that exists today. And as long as the false narrative persists, as long as people believe that Africa had no history, no civilization, no achievements, the exploitation continues. Because the lie isn't just about the past. The lie is about justifying the present. The lie is about maintaining a global economic order built on stolen wealth and stolen history. The lie is about keeping people from asking why things are the way they are. And the lie works because it's been repeated so long by so many people in so many textbooks and museums and movies and TV shows that it feels like truth. But it's not truth. It never was. So here's what I need you to do. Question everything you've been taught about African history. Dig deeper. Read African historians. Visit African museums. Listen to African voices telling their own stories instead of filtered through European perspectives. Understand that every time you see a movie or TV show or textbook that portrays Africa as primitive, you're seeing the continuation of a 500-year-old propaganda campaign. Understand that the Africans who were enslaved, the civilizations that were destroyed, the history that was erased, these weren't unfortunate side effects of colonization. They were the point. The wealth of the West was built on African bodies, African labor, African resources, and African knowledge. And then, to justify the crime, they erased the evidence that Africans had anything worth stealing in the first place. That's the biggest lie. Not that Africa had no civilization, but that erasing that civilization was somehow acceptable, that it was somehow justified, that it somehow didn't matter. It matters. Every stolen artifact sitting in a European museum matters. Every library that was burned matters. Every achievement that was attributed to someone else matters. Every time a child grows up believing their ancestors built nothing, achieved nothing, contributed nothing, that matters. Because until we acknowledge what was stolen, until we tell the truth about what was destroyed, until we restore the historical record and repair the damage done by centuries of lies, the crime continues, the exploitation continues, the injustice continues. And that's why they tried so hard to hide this truth. Because once you know what was taken, you can't help but ask, when are they going to give it back? The biggest lie they told about African civilizations wasn't that they didn't exist. It was that you don't deserve to know they did. But now you know, and you can never unknow it.